Chapter 1. The First Whisper. The village of Ravencroft had always been a place of quiet isolation. Nestled between dense forests and jagged cliffs, it was a forgotten settlement where traditions ran deep and superstitions thrived. Few outsiders ever ventured to its winding, cobbled streets, and those who did never stayed long. The village had no roads leading in or out, only narrow trails known only to those who had walked them since childhood. In the heart of the village stood an ancient well. It was older than the oldest villager, older than the crumbling chapel that had lost its last priest decades ago. The well was made of time-worn stone, its edges smooth from centuries of hands brushing against it. The moss that clung to its sides was thick and damp, untouched by sunlight. No one knew who had built it or when, only that it had always been there, watching. For most of Ravencroft's history, the well had been a necessity, the only reliable source of water. But as the years passed and the villagers dug newer wells, its use dwindled, and a quiet unease settled over it. There were whispers, always whispers, about the well, passed down in hushed voices by firelight. Some said that at night, if you stood close enough and listened carefully, you could hear it murmuring. Not the wind, nor the rustling of leaves, but something else, something speaking. Most dismissed these tales as nonsense. The well was abandoned, its water long since deemed unfit for drinking. But as the seasons changed and winter gave way to a particularly harsh autumn, something shifted. It started with a child, 8-year-old Tomas, the baker's son. One evening, just as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, Tomas returned home from playing near the well, his face pale and his lips trembling. When his mother asked what was wrong, he refused to speak. It wasn't until later that night, after being tucked into bed, that he whispered to his older sister, Elise. "The well," he said. "It knows my name." Elise, barely 13 herself, frowned. "What do you mean?" "I heard it," Tomas insisted, his voice so small it was nearly lost in the creaking of the wooden house. "It whispered to me. It said my name." Elise wanted to laugh, to tell him he was imagining things. But something about the way he clutched the blanket to his chest, the way his hands trembled, made her pause. Instead, she told him it was just the wind, that he was tired, and that he should sleep. By morning, Tomas was dead. His mother found him cold in his bed, his eyes wide open, his lips parted as if caught mid-scream. There were no wounds, no signs of illness, just a terrible stillness, as if something had simply reached out and taken him away. The village mourned. Children weren't supposed to die in their sleep. The doctor, old and near blind, could offer no explanation beyond a muttered mention of weak hearts and the chill of the night. But Elise knew better. She remembered the way Tomas had looked at her, the fear in his eyes, and she remembered his words. "The well knows my name." She told no one of what he had said. Not at the funeral, where the villagers whispered prayers under gray skies. Not in the days that followed, when grief turned to hushed speculation. But the whispers of the villagers could not compare to what she heard one night, alone in her room. A whisper, faint, crawling from the cracks in the walls, seeping through the wooden floorboards. A voice so quiet it could have been imagined, but so clear she knew it was not. It said her name. She did not sleep that night, nor the night after. And by the time the third night arrived, Elise was no longer the only one hearing the whispers. One by one, the villagers heard their own names called in the dark, and one by one, they began to disappear. Chapter 2. Names in the Dark. The night after Tomas's burial, the village was draped in silence. It was not the peaceful kind, but the sort that pressed against the ribs like an iron weight. The villagers, though heavy with grief, carried on with their routines, because what else was there to do? But a shadow lingered over them, And it was not just the passing of a child that had settled deep in their bones. Elise had not spoken a word since the funeral. She had spent the day watching the well from her bedroom window, a single candle flickering on her nightstand. It stood there as it always had, a silent sentinel in the village square, but now it seemed waiting, expectant. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the horizon, Elise forced herself to step outside. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and burning wood. She hesitated on the threshold, eyes locked on the well. A whisper stirred in the back of her mind, reminding her of Tomas's last words. "The well knows my name." Her mother had told her not to go near it. None of them were going near it now. Even the children, usually reckless and wild, kept their distance, casting wary glances at its moss-covered stones. But Elise was no longer a child, and something within her demanded to understand. She took a slow step forward, then another. The closer she came, the louder her heart pounded in her ears. When she reached the well's edge, she hesitated, peering down into its depths. The darkness was absolute, swallowing what little moonlight managed to reach inside. She strained to hear anything: water, wind, an echo, but all that greeted her was silence. Then, a whisper, so faint she thought it was the wind. But then she heard it again, slipping through the air like a thread of smoke. And this time, she knew. It was her name, Elise. She stumbled backward, a cry catching in her throat. Her foot caught on an uneven stone, and she nearly fell. Heart hammering, she turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The houses of the village blurred past her, windows glowing with candlelight, but none of them felt safe. She didn't stop until she reached her home, slamming the door behind her and pressing her back against it. Her mother looked up from the table, startled. "Elise? What's wrong?" Elise opened her mouth, but the words refused to come. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. Her mother sighed, standing to pull her into an embrace. "I know," she whispered. "We all hear it." Elise froze. She pulled back, staring up at her mother's pale, weary face. "You?" Her mother nodded, her expression grim. "It started after Tomas. First, it was just the elders, the ones who already feared death. Then the younger ones began to hear it, too." She cupped Elise's face gently, voice barely more than a breath. "It whispers all our names, one by one." Elise's stomach twisted. Who was last? Her mother hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she said, "Old Marjorie." Elise swallowed. Marjorie had been the village's oldest resident, nearly 90. She had been too frail to leave her home for years. If the whispers had called her last, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Elise's mother rushed to open it, revealing the village's blacksmith, Gregory, his face pale beneath the soot. "She's dead," he said, breathless. "Marjorie is dead." A silence stretched between them, heavy with a terrible understanding. Elise felt it sink deep into her bones, cold and unshakable. The well whispered names, and those whose names it spoke did not live to see another dawn. Chapter 3: A Village of Secrets. The morning after Marjorie's death, the village was eerily still. People spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with the weight of an unspoken fear. No one dared to say it outright, but the truth hung over Ravencroft like a thick fog. The well was choosing them. Elise sat at the wooden table in her family's small home, her fingers curling around the rim of a chipped ceramic mug. She had not slept. Her mother moved about the kitchen, aimlessly tending to things that did not need tending. There was nothing to be done but wait. Wait for the next whisper. Wait for the next name. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets. Elise could hear the distant murmurs of villagers gathering in the square. She knew they would be discussing Marjorie's passing, just as they had discussed Tomas's. 2 deaths in the span of days. The whispers were growing bolder. Elise, her mother's voice cut through her thoughts. Stay inside today. Elise looked up. Her mother's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Why? Because I said so. That was not an answer. But Elise did not argue. She only nodded, though she had already made up her mind. The whispers had started, and Elise needed to know why. As dusk settled over the village, Elise wrapped herself in her wool cloak and slipped from the house. The streets were empty, the lanterns flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. She moved swiftly, her breath visible in the cold air. She had to know, had to understand what was lurking beneath the well's stone mouth. The square was deserted, but the well loomed in the moonlight, untouched by time. Its presence was suffocating. Elise hesitated, then forced herself forward. Every step felt heavier, as though something unseen were pulling her back. She stood at the edge and peered inside. The darkness yawned back at her. Silence. Then, a whisper. It slithered up from the depths like a curling tendril of smoke, faint but unmistakable. Elise's breath hitched. This time, it was not her name. It was another. Gregory. Elise stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her throat. Gregory, the blacksmith. She had to warn him, had to tell him what she had heard. She turned on her heel and ran, feet pounding against the cobblestones as she sped toward his forge. When she arrived, the door was ajar, the faint glow of dying embers casting flickering shadows against the walls. Gregory, she called, stepping inside. No answer. She moved deeper into the forge, past the anvil, past the cooling ironworks. A shape lay slumped against the back wall. Gregory. His eyes were open, glassy. His skin was pale, lips slightly parted as if he had been caught mid-breath. Elise choked on a gasp, stumbling backward. He was gone, just like Tomas, just like Marjorie. The well had spoken his name, and now he was dead. A scream built in Elise's throat, but it never came, because just as she turned to flee the forge, she heard it again. The whisper, soft, distant, but growing closer. And this time, it was her mother's name. Chapter 4. Echoes from Below. Elise ran. The name clung to her mind like a leech, suffocating her thoughts, squeezing her breath. Her mother. The well had whispered her mother's name. The village square was empty, save for the looming silhouette of the well. Its presence felt heavier now, as if it knew she had heard, as if it were waiting to see what she would do. Elise didn't stop. She barreled down the narrow streets, past shuttered windows and unlit lanterns. When she reached her home, she nearly tore the door from its hinges. Mother. Her mother was there, sitting at the table, candlelight casting flickering shadows across her face. She looked up, startled by Elise's sudden entrance. Elise? Elise collapsed against the door, her chest rising and falling with frantic breaths. You can't stay here, she gasped. We have to leave. Now. Her mother frowned, setting down the wooden spoon she had been holding. What are you talking about? The well. Elise choked out. It whispered your name. A long silence stretched between them. Her mother did not speak, did not move. Her face remained unreadable, the candle's glow dancing in her tired eyes. Then, slowly, she stood. I know, she said softly. Elise's breath hitched. What? Her mother exhaled, long and slow, before pulling out the chair across from her. Sit, Elise. No. Elise snapped. You don't understand. The others, Tomas, Marjorie, Gregory, she swallowed, forcing down the bile rising in her throat. They're dead. The well whispered their names, and they all... I know. The weight of those 2 words crushed the air from Elise's lungs. She felt as if she had been struck, as if the world had suddenly tilted and left her grasping for something solid. "How?" she whispered. Her mother's gaze flickered toward the window, where the well loomed just beyond the square. "Because I heard my father's name before he passed, and my grandmother's before him." Her voice was distant, as if recalling a memory buried beneath layers of time. "The whispers have always been here, Elise. The village just chooses to forget between each death." Elise's stomach twisted, but her mother reached across the table and took her hands, squeezing them gently. "You must understand, my love. You cannot run from it." Elise yanked her hands back, shaking her head violently. "No, that's not true. There has to be a way to stop it. There has to be." Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, finally, she spoke. "There is only one way." The air between them stilled. Elise's heart pounded. "What is it?" Her mother hesitated. Then, in a whisper barely louder than the wind outside, she said, "You must listen." Elise frowned. "Listen?" Her mother stood, crossing the room to the wooden chest by the hearth. She knelt, lifting the lid with care, and pulled out something wrapped in a thin cloth. As she unraveled it, the candlelight caught the glint of aged silver. A key. Elise stared at it. "What is that?" Her mother held it out. "It opens the passage beneath the well." Elise recoiled. "There's a passage beneath the well?" Her mother nodded. "Long ago, the elders of this village sealed it. They believed it was the source of the whispers." Her voice darkened. "No one has set foot there in decades." Elise stared at the key, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If there was a way to end this, if there was even the slightest chance, she had to try. With trembling fingers, she took the key. The well would no longer whisper in the dark. She would face whatever lay beneath it. Chapter 5. The Mark of the Cursed. The key in Elise's hand felt heavier than it should have. Its cold metal pressed into her palm as she stood in the dim glow of the candlelight, staring at her mother's solemn expression. A secret passage beneath the well. A place no one had dared to tread in decades. "Where does it lead?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother hesitated before answering. "To whatever lies beneath the whispers." A shiver ran through Elise. She had spent her life fearing the well, avoiding it, listening to the village elders speak of it only in hushed, fearful tones. But now she was expected to go beneath it, to uncover a secret even time itself had chosen to forget. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this." Elise looked down at the key, then at her mother. "If the whispers are choosing people, then I have to try." She swallowed hard. "If there's even a chance to stop it, I have to know." Her mother gave a slow nod. "Then I'll help you." The village was quiet as Elise and her mother stepped into the cold night air. The wind had settled, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. The well loomed in the center of the square, its stones slick with years of mist and rain, its gaping mouth darker than the night itself. Elise's hands trembled as she fitted the key into the rusted lock hidden at the base of the well stones. She half expected it to refuse her, to fight back against her intrusion. But with a soft click, the mechanism gave way. She pulled the rusted grate open, revealing a narrow tunnel descending into darkness. A rush of cold air seeped out, carrying with it a scent both ancient and unfamiliar. Damp earth, stagnant water, and something else. Something Elise couldn't name. "Are you sure about this?" her mother asked. No, she wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Taking a deep breath, Elise grabbed the lantern her mother had brought and stepped down into the passage. The descent was slow, the tunnel walls pressing in as the air grew thick and humid. The deeper they went, the more the weight of the earth above them seemed to squeeze the breath from Elise's lungs. The stone beneath her feet was damp, slick with moss and thyme, and the deeper they went, the stronger the scent became. Like something old, something forgotten. Elise's lantern flickered. "Careful," her mother warned. "There may be drops in the floor." Elise nodded, her pulse hammering. The passage twisted and turned, the air growing colder with every step. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a cavernous space. Elise gasped. The walls were carved with symbols, intricate spirals and shapes she didn't recognize, etched deep into the stone. At the center of the cavern was a pool of black water, its surface eerily still despite the faint sound of something dripping from above. The air here was heavier, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. Her mother stepped forward, running her fingers along the carvings. "These markings, they're old. Older than the village." Elise approached the water, peering into its inky depths. Her reflection wavered, distorted by the flickering light. Then, a ripple. She stumbled back, heart slamming against her ribs. "Did you see that?" Her mother turned, frowning. "See what?" Elise swallowed hard. Something moved. Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the slow drip, drip, drip of water from the cavern ceiling. Then, the whisper came. It wasn't from above. It wasn't from the well. It was here, in the dark, and it was calling her name. Chapter 6, Buried Truths. Elise's breath hitched as the whisper slithered through the cavern, curling around her name like a phantom's caress. The sound was faint yet unmistakable, carried on an unseen current that sent goosebumps crawling up her arms. She glanced at her mother, searching for confirmation. But the older woman's face was locked in unreadable stillness. "You heard that," Elise whispered. Her mother's eyes darted toward the black water. "We shouldn't be here." The weight of those words settled into Elise's bones. The darkness around them felt alive, the air thick with something unspoken. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of wrongness, Elise took a step forward. The water's surface remained undisturbed, but something deep within it shifted, a shadow moving beneath ink. She knelt, gripping the lantern tighter, and peered down. Her own reflection stared back, rippling slightly in the dim glow. And then, a second face appeared beside hers. A sharp gasp tore from her lips as she stumbled backward, sending a splash of water onto the stone floor. The face was gone as quickly as it had come. "Elise!" Her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the pool. "We have to leave. Now." Elise's heart pounded. "Did you see it?" No, her mother's voice was firm, but Elise could see the unease in her eyes. "And I don't want to." The journey back through the passage was far longer than Elise remembered. The silence between her and her mother stretched, thick and unyielding. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, following them. But the tunnel remained empty. Yet the feeling did not leave her. When they finally reached the well's opening, Elise let out a shaky breath. The night air felt stark and pure compared to the suffocating stillness below. The village square was as deserted as when they had left it, the houses standing like silent sentinels against the moonlight. Her mother shut the iron grate and locked it once more. No one else should go down there. Elise turned to her. "But what if we're supposed to?" Her mother's gaze was sharp, laced with warning. "Whatever is down there does not belong to us." Elise wanted to argue, to question, but something in her mother's voice quelled her. She could still feel the whisper against her skin, still see the faint outline of the face in the water. "Go home," her mother said softly. "Try to rest." But as Elise stepped away, a thought clawed its way into her mind, refusing to be ignored. The whisper had called her name, and it was waiting for her. The following day, the village awoke to an unnatural silence. Elise stepped outside and immediately felt it. The world felt muted, No morning chatter, no distant sounds of livestock, no wind rustling through the trees. Even the ever-present creak of old shutters was absent. The village stood in eerie stillness, as if the very air had been swallowed by an unseen force. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved toward the square. A few villagers were already gathered near the well, speaking in hushed tones. Their faces were drawn, their movements hesitant. "What's going on?" Elise asked. Old Merrick, the village carpenter, turned toward her, his expression grim. "No one heard the whispers last night." Elise blinked. "That's good, isn't it?" But the way the villagers exchanged wary glances told her otherwise. "The well has whispered every night for as long as we can remember," another woman said. "Even when we feared it, at least we knew it spoke." Elise's stomach twisted. She had feared the whispers, but their absence felt more terrifying, like something had changed. She looked toward the well, its stone mouth seeming deeper, darker than before. And for the first time in her life, she found herself holding her breath, straining to hear the silence, and fearing what it meant. Chapter 7. The Watchers. Elise could not shake the weight of the silence that gripped the village. The absence of the whispers should have brought relief, yet it settled over the town like a thick fog, suffocating in its stillness. The villagers moved through their routines with haunted eyes, speaking in hushed, uncertain voices, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural quiet. By midday, the tension had become unbearable. Elise stood at the edge of the well, staring down into the darkness. The memory of the face in the water still clung to her mind. The whisper had called her name, and now there was nothing. She reached out, resting a hesitant hand against the cold stone rim. The well was silent, but it no longer felt empty. "Elise." She turned sharply to see Merrick approaching, his usually steady hands ringing together. The old carpenter had been one of the first to dismiss the whispers as mere superstition, but now his face was drawn, his confidence replaced by worry. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice low. "In private." Elise nodded and followed him through the narrow alleys of the village until they reached his workshop. The scent of sawdust clung to the air, but no work had been done that morning. He gestured for her to sit, then paced the length of the room. "There's something I haven't told you," he began, running a hand through his graying beard. "Something about the whispers." Elise leaned forward. "What is it?" Merrick hesitated, then sighed heavily. "The whispers have never stopped before. Not once. Not in my lifetime. Not in my father's or his father's. They come every night without fail. But more than that," he looked at her, his eyes shadowed with unspoken fears. "The whispers don't just predict death. They warn us." Elise frowned. "Warn us? Of what?" Merrick exhaled sharply. "Of something worse." The words sent a shiver down Elise's spine. "You mean the whispers weren't what we should have feared?" Merrick shook his head. "I think they were keeping something at bay. Something that has now woken." A knock at the door made them both jump. Elise turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You need to come. Now." A crowd had gathered near the square. Elise pushed through the villagers, her mother close behind. As she reached the front, her stomach lurched. A man stood at the edge of the well, his back rigid, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His clothes were torn, covered in dirt and dried blood. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling as if grasping for something unseen. It took Elise a moment to recognize him. "Jacob," she whispered. The young farmer had disappeared a week ago, his name one of the last the well had whispered before the silence. He had been presumed dead, another victim of the well's grim prophecy. Yet here he stood, breathing, moving, but not alive. Not truly. Jacob turned his head toward Elise, his eyes hollow and black, his lips parted, but no sound came out. A strangled gasp escaped a nearby woman, and the crowd recoiled as he took a single, stiff step forward. Then, without warning, he collapsed. A ripple of panic surged through the villagers. Some ran, others stood frozen in terror. Elise's mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but Elise couldn't look away. She stared at Jacob's unmoving form, at the way his fingers still twitched. Merrick knelt beside him, hesitating before pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. He looked up, face grim. "He's dead." A heavy silence fell. Elise barely heard the gasps, the murmured prayers, the fearful sobs. Her gaze remained fixed on Jacob's face, on the black void where his eyes should have been. And then, in the absolute silence of the village square, a whisper curled through the air. Soft, distant, and unmistakable. The well had spoken again. Chapter 8. Shadows at the Edge. The days had grown colder as autumn bled into winter. The villagers, once skeptical, had come to dread the long, silent nights when the wind howled through the trees like a living thing. The whispers, however, were no longer confined to the dark recesses of the well. They had crept into every corner of the village, slipping through the cracks of homes, making their way into the hearts and minds of the people. It was as though the well had reached beyond its own boundaries, infecting the very air they breathed. Alice, once a confident woman with little patience for superstition, found herself unable to sleep. Night after night, she tossed and turned, staring out the window into the blackness beyond her home. Her mind wandered to the whispers, the names spoken by the well. Her thoughts would often drift to the faces of those who had already fallen victim to its call. The death toll had grown with each passing week, and no one was immune. Even the strongest among them, those who had once scoffed at the idea of the well being anything more than a mere legend, now spoke in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously to the shadows. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just the wind, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the more she tried to push the thoughts away, the more they clung to her, wrapping around her mind like a suffocating blanket. Alice couldn't ignore the truth much longer. The well was real, and its whispers were the heralds of doom. The village had begun to fracture. Trust had become a rare commodity. Neighbors who had once shared meals and stories now avoided each other, their faces drawn with fear. No one could escape the certainty that sooner or later the well would whisper their name. No one knew who it would be next. No one knew how to stop it. Alice had seen the toll it was taking on everyone. The fear was palpable, hanging thick in the air like smoke. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't let go of the hope that there was an explanation, a reason behind the madness. A reason that didn't involve some malevolent force lurking in the depths of the earth. But she couldn't find it. She couldn't stop herself from imagining the well, its dark waters pooling beneath the village, echoing with the sound of lost souls. The thought consumed her, gnawing at her every waking moment. One evening, as dusk settled over the village, Alice found herself standing before the well once more. She had tried to avoid it, tried to keep her distance, but the whispers had drawn her back. She felt the pull of it, like a magnetic force that would not be denied. The wind had picked up, swirling leaves and dust around her feet. The well stood before her, silent and still, as though it was waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached, the familiar chill of fear crawling up her spine. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening. There was no other choice. She lowered herself to the edge, peering into the darkness below. For a moment, all was silent. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, a soft murmur broke the stillness. The whispers. Alice's heart raced. She strained to hear, but the words were indistinct, just beyond her comprehension. But there was something else, something more urgent. A name, her own name. Her blood ran cold as the realization hit her like a slap to the face. The well had called her. It had chosen her. Panic surged through her chest, and she stumbled backward, her legs weak beneath her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking her desperation. Alice scrambled to her feet and turned to run, but the weight of the moment anchored her in place. The well had her now. There was no escaping it. The whispers would follow her, just as they had followed the others. She had thought she could escape it, but there was no escape from the well. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim. Alice stood frozen, trembling, as the wind howled around her. The whispers continued to swirl in the darkness, echoing her name over and over again. Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't think clearly. All she could hear was the relentless call from below, dragging her down into the depths. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but Alice felt it all the same. The earth seemed to groan, as though something immense and ancient was stirring beneath. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The well was not just a source of whispers. It was a portal to something far worse than she could have ever imagined. The village had always been haunted by the fear of the unknown, but now that fear was real. The well had opened a door, and it wasn't just the dead it was calling. It was calling something darker, something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. Alice didn't wait to find out what would emerge. She turned and fled into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, but they were no longer speaking her name. They were calling for someone else, and soon, the village would fall into chaos. Chapter 9. A Voice That Never Lies. The wind had not ceased. It whipped through the trees like a living creature, twisting and howling in torment. For days, Alice had not been able to escape the weight of what she had discovered. The whispers were growing louder, more demanding, and the village was on the brink of madness. Each day, the fear seemed to build like a storm ready to burst. The villagers had begun to question everything: each other, their beliefs, and the truth they had once held onto so tightly. Was the well really just a relic of an ancient superstition? Or was it something more? Something far more dangerous? Alice hadn't been able to speak to anyone since that night by the well. She couldn't bring herself to face anyone, not after hearing the whispers. She had seen the look in their eyes, the fear, the terror. It was inescapable. No one was safe. Not anymore. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in this, that the well was reaching out to others, to people who hadn't heard the whispers, to people who were still untouched by the darkness that now consumed the village. There were still those who hadn't heard their name called. But how long would that last? Alice's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. She hesitated before crossing the room, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The village had become a place of suspicion, and she knew that any visitor might be there with questions, with fears, or worse, with a warning. The last thing she needed was to get tangled in more uncertainty. She had her own thoughts to unravel. She opened the door slowly, and her breath caught in her throat as she saw who stood there. It was Thomas, the blacksmith, a man she had known since childhood. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his eyes hollow with fear. He was no longer the confident, stoic man she had once known. The weight of the whispers had taken its toll on him too. "Alice," he said, his voice a mere whisper against the howling wind. "I need to talk to you." Without a word, she stepped aside to let him in. He didn't speak as he crossed the threshold, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. He seemed unsure of himself, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. "What's happened?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a murmur. Her heart raced in anticipation, knowing this conversation would be like no other. Thomas exhaled sharply, as though he had been holding his breath for far too long. He ran a hand through his hair, his face contorted with dread. "I heard it," he said, his voice shaking. "The whispers. My name." Alice's breath caught. She had hoped, foolishly, that Thomas would be one of the lucky ones. But there was no escaping it now. No one could outrun the well, not even the ones who had once thought themselves beyond its reach. "Tell me everything," she urged, her voice firm now, despite the tremor in her chest. "I was working late in the forge," he began, his words slow and measured. "It was well past dusk, and the night had already fallen. I was putting the last touches on a plow, just like I've done hundreds of times before. But this time was different. This time, I heard it, the voice, soft at first, almost like a breath in my ear." Alice's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The voice, the whispers. They were always faint at first, almost dismissible, like the wind or a trick of the mind. But as they grew stronger, as they became clearer, they could no longer be ignored. "I thought I was imagining it," Thomas continued, his gaze flicking nervously to the window, as though the whispers might still be lingering outside. "But then it called my name, my full name, the way only my mother used to say it when she was angry with me. And it wasn't just my name. It said something else. Something I didn't understand." Alice leaned in, her heart pounding. "What did it say?" Thomas's eyes darted to hers, his face pale. "It said, 'The circle is incomplete.'" And then it stopped. A cold chill ran down Alice's spine. She didn't know what to make of it. The circle? What did that mean? Was it referring to something that had been lost? Something that had been broken and now needed to be fixed? Or was it a warning? An omen of something far worse? "What do you think it means?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Thomas whispered, his eyes haunted. "But I'm not the only one who's heard it. I've spoken to others. More of us are hearing the whispers now, and none of us can make sense of it. It's like the well is trying to tell us something, but we can't understand it. We can't see what it wants." Alice sat back, her mind racing. The circle, the incomplete circle. Could it be referring to something from the past? Something forgotten? She had to find out. She had to learn more before it was too late. But what was the well trying to say? "I need to go back to the well," Alice said suddenly, her voice resolute. "There has to be an answer there. Something the well is trying to show us. If I don't find it, if I don't understand it, I don't think any of us will survive." Thomas shook his head urgently. "No, Alice. You can't. The well." "I don't have a choice," she interrupted, her eyes hardening. "The well is calling. I can feel it. And I need to know why. I need to understand what's coming." Thomas looked at her, his expression torn. He didn't want her to go. He didn't want anyone to go near the well anymore. But the truth was, none of them could avoid it for much longer. The well's reach was growing, its influence expanding beyond the borders of the village. And the whispers were only the beginning. Chapter 10. The Pact of Silence. Alice couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly at peace. The moment she had heard the whispers, everything had changed. The village she had known her entire life now felt like a shadow, every corner heavy with dread, every step unsure. She had spent sleepless nights pondering the meaning of the well, the nature of its call. And now, with each passing day, it became clear. The well was not just a relic of superstition. It was a living thing, a force of nature far beyond their understanding. It was a chill evening when Alice made her decision. The wind had turned bitter, lashing at her face with icy tendrils as she stood outside her home, looking down the narrow, winding path that led to the well. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the sky a smudged canvas of dark purples and grays. A few villagers passed her by, but none made eye contact. Fear hung in the air like fog, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. Thomas had begged her not to go. He had pleaded with her to stay, to avoid the well at all costs. But Alice had made up her mind. She knew that no matter how much she wished otherwise, there was no escaping it. The whispers were calling her, and she had to answer. With one last glance back at her cottage, she set off toward the well. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her legs unsteady as if the earth itself was trying to pull her back. The trees around her seemed to lean in, their branches scraping against one another in a way that made her skin crawl. The darkness felt like it was closing in, pressing down on her from all sides. But she kept moving forward. There was no turning back. As she neared the well, a sense of dread washed over her. It wasn't the first time she had stood before it, but tonight it felt different, heavier, more alive. The wind had died down, and the silence was almost unbearable. Alice could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the stillness. The well stood before her like a gaping mouth, its dark stones slick with moisture. The air around it was colder, as though it was drawing the warmth from the world around it. She stepped closer, the ground beneath her feet soft with damp earth, and peered into the inky blackness below. Nothing. No whispers. No voices. Just a suffocating silence. But Alice wasn't fooled. She could feel it, the presence of something beneath the surface, something waiting. Her pulse quickened, and she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if she leaned just a little closer. Would the well speak her name again? Would it tell her what she needed to know? Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind blew past her, carrying with it the faintest whisper. It was so soft, so fleeting, that she almost missed it. But it was there, unmistakable. Her name, Alice. The sound of her name was enough to freeze her in place. It was a voice she didn't recognize, but it wasn't like the soft murmurs she had heard before. This was clearer, more distinct, as though someone, or something, was right beside her. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound, and she could almost feel the whispers physically, as if they were tugging at her very soul. Alice. The voice came again, and this time it wasn't a question. It was an imperative, a command. She had to come closer. She had to look deeper. Taking a shaky breath, Alice crouched down, her knees trembling as she leaned over the edge of the well. The black water below seemed to pulse, rippling slightly as though disturbed by some unseen force. She reached out a hand, hovering above the surface, unsure whether to touch it or pull back. But she couldn't resist. Something in her, the same thing that had driven her to return to the well in the first place, drove her forward. With trembling fingers, she dipped her hand into the cool water. Instantly, the temperature around her seemed to drop. A wave of cold washed over her, and the well's surface began to shift. The water below her fingers rippled, swirling in a circular motion as though it were alive, as though it were responding to her touch. Then, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices rising from the depths, filling her ears with names. She couldn't make them out at first, but then one name stood out, her own. Alice. It was no longer a whisper. It was a voice, deep and resonant, reverberating through her chest. She felt a sharp pain in her head, a pressure building behind her eyes. The well was pulling her in, drawing her closer to whatever lay beneath. No, Alice whispered to herself, shaking her head. I can't. But the well wasn't listening. The water below her hand began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, until it was surging toward her. She jerked her hand back, but it was too late. The water began to spill over the edges, flooding the ground around her feet. The air was thick with the whispers, now rising to a deafening crescendo. And then, from deep within the well, a shape began to emerge. Alice gasped and stumbled backward, her heart racing. The shape, dark and formless at first, began to solidify, taking the shape of a figure. It was humanoid, but there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. The figure's form seemed to ripple and distort, as though it were made of smoke or shadow. It was tall, towering above her, its presence pressing down on her chest. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the figure began to move. It reached toward her, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and gnarled, twisting in the air like tendrils. Alice tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure's fingers brushed her face, cold as ice, and in that moment, Alice knew. The well had been waiting for her, and now it had her. The figure's grip tightened, pulling her closer to the well. The water churned violently, and the whispers became an unbearable roar. She could see nothing but darkness now, the figure's presence consuming her vision. The earth trembled beneath her, the world tilting sideways as the ground gave way beneath her feet. And then there was nothing. Chapter 11. Blood in the Water. The village was no longer a place of safety. It had become a land haunted by shadows, by the whispers that never ceased. In the days since Alice's disappearance, nothing had been the same. Her absence weighed heavily on everyone who had known her, and yet, it was not the silence that followed her loss that troubled the villagers most. It was the growing realization that something darker had taken root, something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. No one spoke of Alice anymore, not directly. Her name was a curse, a reminder of the fate that could await anyone brave or foolish enough to seek answers at the well. The whispers had stopped calling her name, but their presence remained, like a thick fog that could not be shaken. The village, once a close-knit community, had begun to splinter. Eyes darted suspiciously across the streets, and whispers were shared in hushed tones behind closed doors. No one felt safe. Thomas, the blacksmith, had not left his home in days. The fear had taken hold of him more than it had anyone else. He had tried to deny it, tried to pretend that it was all some mass hysteria, but now, with Alice gone, the truth was undeniable. The well was real, its power far stronger than he had ever imagined. He could still hear her voice, the last words she had spoken to him before disappearing. "I have to go back," she had said. "The well is calling me. I need to know what it wants." And now, she was gone, taken by the well, swallowed by the darkness that had waited for her. No one had seen her again, and no one had dared to search. The villagers had long given up hope of finding answers. The well had claimed another soul, but for Thomas, the pain of her loss was compounded by a new and insidious terror. The whispers had started again. They were not calling his name, not yet, but they were louder now, echoing through the quiet nights, curling around his thoughts, taunting him with their presence. He had tried to ignore them, to bury the fear deep inside, but it was impossible. The well's reach was far, and it would not let him go so easily. Sitting in his darkened home, he stared at the forge, cold and unused, his thoughts racing. He had to do something. The village needed answers. Someone needed to confront the well, to understand what it was, to find a way to stop it before more lives were taken. But Thomas was afraid. He had never been a man of action, a man of courage. He had been content in his work, in the simple life of a blacksmith, until the well had come and shattered everything. And now, with the whispers growing louder every day, he couldn't ignore the call any longer. There was only one person he could think of who might have the courage to face the well again. One person who had seen its darkness firsthand, who might still have the strength to return. Alice had believed there was a secret beneath the well, a truth waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps she had been right. Perhaps the well wasn't just a force of destruction. It could be something more, something that could be stopped, if only they understood it. But she was gone. As the night deepened and the wind outside began to howl once more, Thomas stood up abruptly. He couldn't sit here any longer, wallowing in his fear. He had to find a way to put an end to this madness. If there was any chance of saving the village, he would have to face it. He would have to return to the well. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the night, his breath misting in the cold air. The streets were empty, the silence oppressive. The village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Thomas didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Not now. The path to the well was familiar, but tonight it felt different. The trees loomed like sentinels on either side of him, their branches gnarled and twisted, reaching out to him with unnatural urgency. The air grew colder with every step, as though the very earth was rejecting him, urging him to stay away. But Thomas pressed on, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the clearing, he saw the well standing before him, its dark mouth gaping open, waiting. The whispers were louder now, though still unintelligible. They had become an overwhelming presence, an unholy symphony that filled his mind and his soul with dread. But Thomas could not stop. Not now. He took one last step forward, his feet crunching on the frost-covered ground, and knelt beside the well. The air around it was thick with energy, the weight of it pressing down on him like 1,000 unseen hands. He reached out cautiously, touching the stone with trembling fingers. And then, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as though the well had gone still, waiting, watching. For a moment, Thomas thought he had imagined it, that he was losing his mind just like everyone else. But then, a voice broke the silence. Alice. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The voice was not his own, nor was it the familiar murmur of the villagers. It was cold, distant, filled with an ancient sorrow. It was the same voice he had heard when Alice had disappeared. The well was speaking to him now, its deep, resonant voice echoing through his very bones. Alice is gone, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. What do you want from us? The well did not answer, but as Thomas stared into the dark abyss below, he saw something that should not have been there. A shadow, dark and formless, moving beneath the surface of the water. It was slowly rising, pulling itself from the depths, stretching upward toward him. The whispers began again, this time clearer, more distinct. They were not just calling his name, they were calling the village. The well had a message, a demand, and it would not rest until it was heard. Thomas stumbled back, his body trembling with fear. But he couldn't look away. The shadow rose higher, its tendrils reaching out, grasping for him. The cold air turned freezing, and the whispers became louder, more insistent. The well was hungry. It wanted more, and there was no way to stop it. Chapter 12. The last name spoken. The village had descended into a state of quiet hysteria. Fear had become a living thing, seeping into the cracks of every home, every street. The whispers were everywhere. It wasn't just at night anymore. Now they followed the villagers throughout their day. They were soft at first, barely audible, like the wind brushing through the trees. But now they were persistent, never ceasing, filling the spaces between words, filling the empty spaces in their minds. Thomas had returned to his home after standing before the well, his mind reeling with the sight of that shadow rising from the dark water, its tendrils stretching, reaching. The air had grown colder with every passing moment, until the very earth beneath his feet seemed to vibrate with something unnatural. He hadn't dared touch the well again, hadn't dared to listen to it speak. Instead, he had fled, consumed with a terror so deep. It gnawed at his insides like a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. But even in the safety of his own home, the whispers had followed him. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the corners of his vision. Thomas could hear them when he closed his eyes, when he tried to sleep. They were speaking to him, beckoning him, urging him to return to the well. There was no escaping it. As the days stretched on, the village began to change. The once lively streets were now quiet, the market stalls left abandoned, the chimneys silent. People kept to their homes, afraid to venture outside, afraid that the well would call them next. Those who had dared speak of it, who had tried to search for Alice or to find answers, were gone, swallowed up by the well without a trace. There were whispers of something more, something darker than even the well. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the spirits of those who had been taken, about how their voices now mingled with the whispers. Some said they had seen shadows moving in the corners of their vision, seen figures standing just beyond the tree line, watching them. Others swore they heard their loved ones' voices calling to them, calling them home, calling them to the well. Thomas knew the truth now. The well didn't just take life, it took memories too. It was a vessel, a gateway to something beyond their understanding, and it would not rest until it had claimed them all. The burden of this knowledge pressed heavily on him as he sat in the dim light of his cottage, his eyes fixed on the dark corner where shadows lingered. The whispers had grown louder again, closer. The air was thick with the weight of them, and Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before the well came for him, too. But he couldn't go to the well. He couldn't let it take him like it had taken Alice. He had to find a way to end it, to stop the madness before it consumed everyone. There was one place left to go, one person who might know more. He had heard her name spoken in the village, in hushed, fearful tones, a name tied to the very origins of the well. Edith Lorne, an old woman who had lived on the outskirts of the village for as long as anyone could remember. She was a recluse, a woman of strange habits and eccentric ways. But more importantly, she was the only person in the village who still spoke openly about the well. She had lived here when the well had first appeared, decades ago, and some believed she knew its secrets. The thought of visiting her made Thomas uneasy. There was something unsettling about Edith, something that made him wonder if she knew more than she let on. But he had no choice. If there was any hope of stopping the well, it lay in her knowledge. Taking a deep breath, Thomas gathered his courage and stood. The whispers seemed to grow louder as he opened the door, as though the very air was watching him, waiting. He stepped out into the cold night, the familiar path stretching before him, leading him toward the edge of the village. The air was thick with fog as he made his way down the winding road, the trees looming above him like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out with unnatural stillness. He could feel the weight of the village's fear on his shoulders, the stifling presence of something just beyond his understanding. It wasn't long before he reached Edith's cottage. It sat at the very edge of the woods, isolated from the rest of the village, surrounded by overgrown ivy and the remnants of long-forgotten gardens. The windows were dark, the door closed tight, but Thomas could feel something drawing him in, something telling him to knock. He hesitated for a moment before raising his hand and rapping sharply on the door. The sound echoed through the stillness of the night, and for a long moment there was no answer. But then, from inside, there was movement, a slow, deliberate shuffling, the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing Edith standing in the doorway, her old face shadowed by the flickering candlelight within. She looked at him with wide, pale eyes, as though she had been waiting for him. "You've come," she said, her voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. "I knew you would." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear and uncertainty. "I need to know what you know about the well," he said, his voice rough. "I need to understand what's happening to the village. People are disappearing. Alice is gone. It's taking everything." Edith studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp, knowing. Then, with a slow nod, She stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. "Come in," she said softly. "You've been called by the well, haven't you?" Thomas hesitated, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with the scent of dried herbs and aged wood. There were books stacked haphazardly around the room, strange symbols etched into the pages. But it was the center of the room that caught his attention. A large wooden chest, its surface worn and scarred by time. "Sit," Edith instructed, her voice carrying the same weight as her gaze. "I will tell you what you need to know." As Thomas sank into the chair, the whispers outside seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet stillness of the cottage. Edith began to speak, and the words she spoke were unlike anything he had expected. "The well is not just a well," she said, her voice steady and sure. "It is a doorway, a portal to something older than time itself. It calls to those who are vulnerable, those who feel the weight of the world pressing on them. It whispers to them, offers them escape, offers them release." "Escape from what?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From themselves," Edith replied. "From their pain, their regret, their fear. The well offers them the chance to forget, to lose themselves in the darkness. But there is always a price, and that price is far greater than anyone could imagine." Thomas's heart sank as he listened to her words. The well didn't just take lives, it took memories. It took pieces of their very souls. And once it had them, it would not let go. "Is there any way to stop it?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Edith's eyes glinted with an ancient knowledge, and she gave him a sad smile. "The only way to stop it is to remember," she said softly. "To remember everything it has taken. To confront the darkness it has brought into the world." But Thomas already knew. The well had taken Alice, and now it would take him too. Chapter 13. Hunted by Fate. Thomas couldn't remember when the whispers had become so unbearable. It was as if they had always been there, a constant hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. They had taken root in his mind, curling like tendrils of fog, growing thicker, more insistent. He couldn't escape them, couldn't silence them, and they wouldn't let him forget. Every moment he spent in Edith's cottage felt heavy, laden with the knowledge that there was no easy way out. The weight of the truth pressed on him, suffocating him with the realization that the well's grasp was not just physical. It was spiritual, psychological. It burrowed into the very fabric of the village's existence, drawing its strength from the darkness in the hearts of those it touched. Edith's words echoed in his mind as he left her cottage, stepping back into the cold night air. To stop it, you must remember. But what did that mean? How could remembering be the key to breaking the cycle of death, of loss, of fear? He found himself walking aimlessly, his feet carrying him through the fog-covered village. The buildings around him seemed to loom, their silhouettes sharp against the murky sky, as if watching him, waiting. The streets were empty, silent, and the weight of isolation hung heavy in the air. He was alone with his thoughts, with the growing certainty that the village was slipping further and further into madness. There was no one left to trust, no one who could help him. Edith had given him the answers he sought, but the price of knowing them was a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. The whispers grew louder, more distinct now. His name was the only thing they spoke. "Thomas," they said, each syllable dripping with a strange mixture of love and menace. "Thomas, come back." He shook his head, trying to block them out, but the more he tried, the louder they became. It was as though the village itself was calling to him, urging him to return to the well. He wanted to ignore it, wanted to turn away, but something deep within him told him that he couldn't. The memory of Alice's disappearance haunted him. She had been the first to vanish, the first to hear the whispers. She had been the one to go to the well without hesitation, to follow its call without questioning it. And now, she was gone. Not just lost, gone, erased from the world, as though she had never existed. The well had claimed her, and Thomas had been powerless to stop it. As he walked, the whispers grew in intensity, following him like a shadow, like a presence he couldn't outrun. They echoed through the empty streets, slipping into the cracks of his mind, until he could barely think, could barely breathe. He stopped at the edge of the village, standing in the dark, shivering under the weight of the cold and the pressure of the voices pressing in on him. Then, as if answering the call, he turned. He couldn't explain why. It was as though some unseen force was guiding him, urging him to return. The path to the well stretched before him, shrouded in mist, beckoning him. It was the same path he had taken when he first heard the whispers, the same path Alice had taken, and the same path that now seemed to hold every answer, every truth. He walked. The night was thick with fog as he made his way back to the well. His feet felt heavy, each step sinking deeper into the earth beneath him. The whispers followed him, swirling in his mind, until they were all he could hear. His pulse raced in his ears, but his body moved without hesitation. He could feel the pull of the well, its call growing stronger with every step. When he reached it, he stood there for a long moment, staring into the inky blackness that lay beneath the surface. The wind whispered through the trees, but the sound was different now, more urgent, more insistent. The well was waiting. It was always waiting. Thomas took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. He could feel the well's pull in every bone, in every fiber of his being. He reached out a hand, trembling, as if he could already feel the darkness curling around him, ready to pull him in. And then, just as his fingers brushed the edge of the stone, a voice rang out from behind him. "Stop!" Thomas spun around, his heart leaping in his chest, only to find Edith standing in the fog, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice frantic, her hands shaking. "You can't go through with this. You don't know what you're asking for." "I have to," Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse, his mind clouded by the overwhelming weight of the whispers. "I have to stop it. I have to stop it before it takes anyone else." "You don't know what it will cost," Edith cried, stepping forward. "The well doesn't just take lives. It takes memories. It takes everything. Once you've heard its call, once you've felt its pull, there's no going back." Thomas's breath hitched as the realization sank in. "What do you mean? What happens if I go through with it?" Edith's gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked almost sad. "If you step into the well, it will take everything from you. It will erase you from existence. Your memories, your life, everything will be gone. The well doesn't just claim souls, it claims who you are. It will make you forget yourself, forget everything you've ever known. And when you're gone, there will be nothing left of you but a shadow." Thomas took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "Then what do I do?" His voice was desperate, raw. "How do I stop this?" "You must remember," Edith said, her voice low and urgent. "The well can only take what you are willing to give. If you fight back, if you remember everything it has taken, if you refuse to forget, it loses its power. But it won't be easy. The well will fight you. It will twist your memories, twist your mind. But if you hold on to who you are, if you remember the truth, you can stop it." Thomas's mind raced. Remember. He had to remember. "Remember what?" he asked, his voice trembling. Edith's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, he saw something in her gaze. Something ancient, something full of sorrow. "Remember why you came here," she whispered. "Remember the people you've loved, the ones you've lost. Remember what's worth fighting for. Only then can you stop it. Only then can you stop the well from taking everything." As her words sank in, Thomas felt the weight of them press down on him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been lost to the well. Alice, the villagers, everyone who had been claimed by its darkness. With a final look at Edith, Thomas turned back to the well. His hand hovered above the water, and for the first time since he had heard the whispers, he felt something else. Strength. A resolve to remember, to hold on to who he was. And as he whispered the names of those he had loved, as he remembered the warmth of their voices and the laughter they had shared, he felt the pull of the well begin to weaken. But the battle had only just begun. Chapter 14. The madness spreads. The well stood before him, still and foreboding, as though it could swallow him whole at any moment. Thomas's breath was shallow, his hand trembling just inches above the dark surface. He could feel the weight of the village pressing down on him, the whispers still clawing at his mind, urging him to let go, to give in. But Edith's words echoed in his mind. Remember, hold on to what you love. And as much as the well tried to pull him in, he couldn't forget. Not yet. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was moving, awakening. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the well could sense his resistance. He could feel it in his bones, the ancient power of the well, twisting and warping his thoughts. It wanted him. It needed him. But Thomas wouldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. He stepped back from the edge, his mind racing. What did he have to do? What was it he needed to remember? His memories seemed to slip through his fingers, fading like the mist around him, always just out of reach. And then it hit him. The faces of those he had loved. Alice's bright, laughing eyes, the warmth of her embrace, the way she had made him feel like the world was full of possibilities. His mother's gentle smile, the sound of her voice calling his name when he was a child. His father's quiet strength, always there to protect him, to guide him. These were the memories he had to hold on to. The people who had shaped him, who had made him who he was. The whispers were growing louder now, a cacophony of voices calling out to him, each one more insistent than the last. They weren't just speaking his name anymore. They were speaking the names of the people he had loved, the people he had lost. His mother, his father, Alice, the villagers. He reached into the deepest corners of his mind, grasping at the threads of those memories, pulling them close. The more he focused, the more vivid they became, the clearer the faces appeared in his mind. He saw Alice, her face alight with joy as they danced under the stars. His father, strong and steadfast, lifting him up in the air when he was just a boy. His mother, her voice a soft lullaby that had soothed him through the darkest nights. He whispered their names aloud, one by one. Alice, mother, father. Each name felt like a prayer, a plea for strength, a call for help. But the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. They swirled around him, filling his head with their voices. Give in. Let go. Come back to us. Thomas's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to consume him. But he couldn't give in. He couldn't let the well win. His eyes locked onto the surface of the water, and for a moment, he saw something shift within it, a face. A face he recognized. Alice. Her image flickered beneath the surface, a pale reflection of her smiling face. She reached out to him, her hand almost breaking the surface of the water. Come to me, she whispered, her voice a soft caress. It's safe here. You don't have to fight anymore. Let go. You know you want to. He gasped, stumbling back, his breath catching in his throat. He shook his head, tears blurring his vision. "No, no, I won't." But the face remained, lingering in the water, her eyes pleading with him. It was so tempting, so easy to give in, to join her in the darkness. But he remembered. He remembered the love they had shared, the way she had always made him feel alive, and he couldn't let her go like this. He couldn't let her become part of the well's endless hunger. "Alice," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I won't forget you. I won't let you go." Her face faded from the surface of the water, replaced by shadows that seemed to stretch out and swirl, threatening to consume him. The whispers began again, louder than ever. "Come back. You can't resist. You can't escape." But he stood firm. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and focused on the love he had for Alice, for his family, for everything he had lost. He had to fight for it. He had to remember. With each name he spoke, each memory he clung to, the power of the well seemed to weaken, its grip loosening on him, on the village, on everything it had claimed. He could feel it, a shift in the air, as if the very earth beneath him was waking from a long slumber. He whispered one last name, the name that had started it all, Edith, and with that, the whispers fell silent. For a long moment, Thomas stood there, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had broken the cycle. The well had no power over him anymore. But as he stood there, alone in the fog, something still felt off. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive silence that made his skin crawl. The darkness of the night seemed to stretch on forever, and the village, now eerily quiet, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He turned back to the well, his eyes scanning its depths one last time. The water was still, the surface unbroken, as though nothing had changed. But Thomas knew better. The well had been stopped. The cycle had been broken. He had won. Or so he thought. A faint whisper reached his ears, so soft he almost didn't hear it. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling, a chill that crept down his spine. "It's not over." The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the wind picked up once again, swirling in frenzied gusts. The well, though silent, seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, as if it had been temporarily stilled, waiting. Thomas felt his stomach turn, his heart racing as the weight of that feeling settled over him. The whispers had stopped, yes, but something else was coming, and this time, he didn't know if he was ready for it. Chapter 15. A Well Without a Bottom. The air hung heavy with an unspoken dread, a weight that pressed down on Thomas's chest, making it hard to breathe. The wind howled through the trees, but the whispers had died, leaving behind a silence that was more unnerving than any sound. It felt as though the very fabric of the world had shifted, and Thomas was standing on the precipice, looking down into the abyss. He had thought it was over. He had thought he had won. But the chill in the air, the subtle tremor beneath his feet, told him otherwise. The well had not been silenced. It had only paused, waiting for something, waiting for him. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The village, once filled with whispers, now stood in complete stillness. The houses, the streets, the very land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Thomas turned away from the well, his heart racing as his feet carried him back toward the village. He needed to find someone, anyone. He couldn't face whatever was coming alone. As he walked, his mind raced. What had he done? He had stood at the edge of the well and fought back its pull, but had he really defeated it? The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. He hadn't broken the well's power. He had only delayed it. The thing in the depths of the well wasn't something that could be so easily stopped. It was a force older than time itself, a darkness woven into the very fabric of the village. And now, he could feel it awakening once more, like the rumble of distant thunder before a storm. He reached the village square, where the fog had grown thicker, obscuring his vision. The houses loomed like shadows in the mist, their windows dark and uninviting. There was no sign of life, no sound of movement, no faint glow from lanterns or hearths. It was as if the village had been abandoned overnight. The silence was deafening, and as Thomas made his way down the narrow street, his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the stillness. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a sensation of being watched. The village had never felt like this before, not even in the dead of night. This was different. This was something else. The chill in the air intensified, and Thomas quickened his pace, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. Something had changed. He reached the old church at the end of the street, its doors hanging open, swaying slightly in the breeze. The building looked even more foreboding in the fog, its stone walls crumbling, the windows dark and empty. The church had always been a place of solace, a place of refuge, but now it felt like a tomb, waiting to swallow him whole. With a sense of dread settling over him, Thomas stepped inside. The interior of the church was cold, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The pews were empty, their wood worn and cracked, as though they had been abandoned for years. The altar, once gleaming with candles and flowers, was now covered in shadows, its once sacred space feeling hollow and lifeless. As he moved deeper into the church, he noticed something strange. There, at the far end of the room, near the altar, stood a figure. A woman. Her back was to him, her long, dark hair cascading down her back like a veil. She stood perfectly still, as though frozen in place. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He recognized her immediately. It was Edith. Her figure was pale, almost ethereal, as though she were made of mist rather than flesh. She seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, her face obscured by the shadows. But there was no mistaking her. It was her, the woman who had warned him about the well, who had tried to help him understand the darkness that lurked in the village. Edith? His voice trembled as he spoke her name. She didn't respond. He took a cautious step forward, his feet heavy on the worn stone floor. As he approached her, he noticed that the air around her seemed to distort, as if reality itself was bending in her presence. The light flickered, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were alive, crawling toward him. "Edith, what's happening?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to face him slowly, her eyes hollow and empty, as though something vital had been ripped away from her. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Her face was gaunt, pale, and her skin appeared almost translucent, as though she were not entirely of this world. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down his spine, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice soft but filled with a sorrow that made Thomas's heart ache. "It's too late now. The well has already claimed you." Thomas staggered backward, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "What do you mean? I thought I stopped it." No," Edith interrupted, her gaze fixed on him. "You only delayed the inevitable. The well cannot be stopped. Not by you, not by anyone. It has existed long before this village was built, and it will continue long after it is gone. It feeds on the fear and sorrow of those who encounter it. And now, it has found its new victim." Thomas shook his head, refusing to believe her. "No, I won't let it happen. I won't let it take me. I won't." Edith's expression softened, her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. "You don't understand. It's not just you. It's all of us. The well doesn't care about individuals. It cares only for the village, for its power. And now, it's too late to stop it. It has already begun." The ground trembled again, this time with more force, shaking the very foundation of the church. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the building itself were being pulled apart by some unseen force. Thomas could feel the air grow colder, and a strange pressure began to build in his chest. He looked around, panic rising in his throat, but Edith's figure was fading, melting into the shadows. "No," he cried out. "Please, tell me what to do. How can I stop it? How can I?" But she was gone. The church was empty once more. The whispers returned, this time louder than ever, swirling around him in a deafening cacophony. Thomas stumbled back, his mind racing, his heart hammering in his chest. He had to find a way to stop it. He had to save the village. But how? The well had always been part of this place. He had tried to fight it, but now he understood. It was never just a well. It was a reflection of the village itself, its fears, its regrets, its sins. And now, those sins were coming home to roost. The ground shook once more, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The well was waiting for him. It was calling him back. And Thomas knew, deep down, that this time, he wouldn't be able to escape. Chapter 16. The Final Descent. The darkness had fallen completely over the village, and the once innocent land now seemed to pulse with a quiet, malignant energy. Every step Thomas took felt like he was descending deeper into the heart of some unspeakable truth. The air was thick with a sense of finality, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He had been inside the church for what seemed like an eternity, yet the whispers of the well still tugged at the edges of his consciousness, like distant echoes in the back of his mind. Edith's face, pale and sorrowful, was burned into his thoughts. Her warning echoed endlessly, repeating in a loop, "It's too late now. The well has already claimed you." Her words were not merely a warning. They were a prophecy. Thomas couldn't escape the truth that had been laid before him. The well was not just a physical location. It was a force, a presence that had woven itself into the very fabric of the village. It had no beginning, no end. It had always been here, waiting for the moment when the fear and darkness of the villagers would be strong enough to summon it. And now, it had found him. He had thought that the well's power could be defeated with courage, with defiance. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that courage alone wasn't enough. The well didn't need fear to thrive. It needed belief. Belief in its power, belief in its inevitability, belief that it was the end. The deeper he pondered it, the more hopeless it felt. He was bound to it, tied by the same threads that had ensnared everyone who had ever walked through the village. There was no escaping it now. The well had already taken root in his soul, its whispers forever echoing in his heart. With a heavy heart and a sense of finality settling over him, Thomas exited the church. He needed to see it again. The well? He needed to understand why it had done this to him, why it had chosen him. And so, he made his way back through the fog, towards the village outskirts, where the well stood like a dark sentinel. The closer he came, the stronger the pull became. He could feel the ground beneath him tremble with each step, as though the earth itself was responding to the well's call. The wind howled louder now, and the once subtle whispers became clearer. They swirled around him like a storm, and Thomas could swear he could hear his own name among them, spoken in 1,000 different voices, none of which sounded like his own. As he reached the clearing where the well stood, the full weight of its presence crashed over him. The air was colder here, as if the well itself drew the warmth from the earth. The stone walls of the well towered before him, the gaping darkness at its center like an open wound, waiting to devour him whole. Thomas stepped forward, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his legs heavy as if weighed down by the world. He could feel the shadows crawling along the ground, stretching toward him, urging him closer. He fought against the instinct to turn and flee, but the pull was too strong. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and he could no longer tell if they were in his mind or if they came from the well itself. "Come closer." The voice was low and haunting, like the rustle of leaves in the dead of night. Thomas couldn't help himself. He stepped forward. The closer he got to the well, the more his heart raced, the more his thoughts became muddled. It felt like time itself was slowing, stretching, as if the world was narrowing down to this one moment. The air around the well shimmered, as though reality itself was warping. He leaned over the edge, staring into the blackness below. It seemed to stretch endlessly, an abyss without end. The wind whipped around him, the fog swirling like a living thing. In that moment, Thomas felt a strange sense of clarity. The well wasn't just a well. It was a mirror, a reflection of the darkness inside of him, inside all of them. It didn't just consume the village. It fed off its memories, its regrets, its sorrow. And now, it was feeding off him. "You cannot escape." The voice was clearer now, more insistent. "You belong to the well now." Thomas's mind swirled, and for a moment, he thought he heard a second voice, a familiar voice, a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Thomas." He froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was his mother's voice, the voice he had heard so many times as a child, soothing him, calling him home. He hadn't heard it in so long, and the sound of it pierced through the haze of fear and confusion that clouded his mind. "Thomas, you must listen." He tried to shake his head, tried to push away the sound, but it was like a rope pulling him deeper into the well's grasp. The voice continued, soft and comforting, and yet there was something dark beneath it, something wrong. "Come closer, Thomas. Look into the depths. You will understand everything." Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. His breath hitched as the memories of his childhood came flooding back, the moments of warmth, of love, of safety. But the more he listened, the more distorted the voice became. The sweetness twisted into something sinister, a lure that dug into his heart. He reached out, his hand trembling as he hovered just above the edge of the well. He could feel the darkness drawing him in, its cold fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him closer, urging him to fall. "Let go," the voice whispered. "You can finally rest." He felt his body stiffen, as though he were no longer in control of his own movements. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then something inside him snapped. He wrenched his arm back, stumbling away from the well, his chest heaving with panic. No, he couldn't give in. He couldn't let it take him. He turned and ran, as fast as his legs would carry him, the whispers growing fainter with each step. His mind raced as he fled the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The well was not just a thing of stone and water. It was a force that preyed on the weakest parts of the soul, and it was always waiting for those who would listen to its call. And as Thomas ran through the mist, he realized that the well would never stop calling. It would never stop waiting. The darkness wasn't just out there. It was inside him now, a seed planted deep within his heart, and it was growing. Chapter 17. The Whisperer's Secret. The village was silent as Thomas stumbled back through the mist, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the well's presence pressed against him, a suffocating reminder that it had claimed him. There was no escaping it now. The whispers still echoed in his mind, soft and insidious, like the rustle of 1,000 leaves in the dead of night. He had run from the well, but he knew that it wasn't done with him. No matter how far he went, no matter how fast he ran, it would follow. The darkness wasn't just a thing of the past. It wasn't a relic of ancient superstition. The well was alive, and its roots had sunk deep into the very heart of the village. The villagers had always known, hadn't they? They had known that there was no escape. That was why they had built their lives around it, because it was always there, waiting. It was why they had hidden their secrets beneath its surface. It was why they had whispered in the dark, hoping to keep the well's power at bay, hoping it wouldn't consume them. Thomas's legs ached as he stumbled through the fog, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had learned. He had always believed that he was strong enough to fight the darkness, but now he realized the terrible truth. There was no fighting it. The well was not a thing to be defeated. It was a thing to be endured. It was a part of them all. The streets of the village were deserted as he walked, the silence pressing down on him like a physical force. The few houses that still stood were empty, their windows dark and hollow. The once vibrant village now seemed like a forgotten place, its life drained away by the well's influence. Thomas had returned to the village in search of answers, but the more he searched, the more questions arose. He had thought that understanding the well would bring him peace, but instead, it had brought him only confusion. It had shown him the depths of his own fears, the things he had buried deep within himself. And now, those fears had taken root, spreading like a disease through his mind and soul. He reached the edge of the village and looked out toward the hills where the well stood. Even from this distance, he could feel its pull, a magnetic force that drew him in, beckoning him back. He could see it in his mind's eye, the ancient stone structure looming in the mist, the darkness swirling around it like a vortex. Thomas knew what he had to do. There was no more running. He had to face the well, had to confront the darkness that had consumed him. He had to understand what it wanted from him, why it had chosen him. He had to face the truth, no matter how unbearable it was. The fog grew thicker as he walked toward the well, and the whispers grew louder. He could hear them now, clearer than ever before. They weren't just voices. They were thoughts. His deepest, most hidden fears and regrets. They whispered to him, urging him to stop, to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know. As he neared the clearing, the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was alive, reacting to his presence. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. The village was silent, the only sound the rustle of the leaves in the trees. And the whispers, "You've come back." The voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a knife. Thomas froze. He knew that voice. It was the voice of Edith, the woman he had failed to protect, the woman who had tried to warn him. "You shouldn't have come," her voice continued, full of sorrow. "You were never meant to know." Thomas's heart clenched. He had always known that he couldn't escape this, but now, standing on the edge of the clearing, with the well looming before him, he understood the terrible truth. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about finding a way out. The well had claimed them all, in one way or another. Why did you have to know? Edith's voice whispered again. Why couldn't you just leave it alone? Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. His hands trembled as he reached for the stone edge of the well, the cold, rough surface biting into his skin. He leaned over, peering into the black void below, and then, with a final, shuddering breath, he spoke. "I'm not afraid." The words hung in the air, an echo that seemed to reverberate through the fog. There was no answer at first, no reply from the darkness. But then, slowly, a shape began to form in the depths of the well. A figure, familiar, yet somehow wrong. It was Edith, or at least it looked like her. Her face was twisted, her features distorted, as if the well had taken her image and twisted it into something unrecognizable. "You never understood," the figure whispered. "You can't fight it. You never could." Thomas staggered back, his heart racing. He had never been more terrified in his life. But he stood firm, his gaze locked on the shape in the well. "It's too late," the voice said, low and cold. "The well has you now. You are part of it. You always have been." The figure's face twisted into a grin, and the air around Thomas seemed to pulse with dark energy. It was then that he understood. The well wasn't just a force that could be fought or understood. It was a part of the very fabric of the world. It was a manifestation of the fears, regrets, and darkness that lived in every soul. It wasn't a thing to be defeated. It was a thing that had always been and would always be. Thomas turned and ran, but this time, there was no escaping it. He could feel it behind him, a weight on his shoulders, a presence that followed him with every step. The whispers were in his head, louder than ever before, until they became a deafening roar, drowning out all other sound. As he reached the edge of the village, he stopped and turned back one last time. The well stood there, silent, waiting, but the whispers were still there, too, swirling in his mind, claiming him. And then, as he took his final steps into the unknown, he realized the terrible truth. The well was not just a place. It was a part of him now, a dark reflection of his own soul, and there was no escaping it. The whispers would never stop. They would never stop following him.